So the president, when the president first called for the Recovery Act to be signed, and specifically used the word recovery, not stimulus, the notion of these reforms, which I'll run through, was in education was present in his thinking. The fundamental point of the education section of the Recovery Act, from the president and from Arnie's view, was both to help get dollars into the economy in a sector that needed it, including averting job cuts, but secondly, to improve our long-term economy by getting better outcomes for kids. And so the question from the beginning was how to use this funding to not only help save jobs, but how to get better outcomes. And Mike will talk about how the funds are used over the next couple of years. But the four assurances here, the four reform areas that you'll be seeing a lot of in the coming months, really were in the act the four areas that the Recovery Act called on states to make progress on is part of in exchange for receiving this funding. So I'll run through these four, and I guess I would note for you that these are not only assurances for the receipt that have to be signed for the receipt of stabilization funds. They're a big part of what it takes to get Race to the Top funding. States will be competing for $5 billion, and these will become criteria for receiving those funds. And these will wind up informing a lot of work, including likely the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So these were not one-time issues. Here are the four. The first is a focus on college-ready and career-ready standards and high-quality assessments. Second is on the law requires that states establish longitudinal data systems that provide really useful information that meet the dimensions that outlined in the America Competes Act. The third is to drive and improve teacher effectiveness and ensure an equitable distribution of qualified teachers for low-income students. And fourth is to really intensively and aggressively intervene in low-performing schools. And those four principles guide our work in this area and in others. And if you go to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit more specifically what that means in context of the Stabilization Fund. Specifically, in order for a state to receive the stabilization funds, they, in the first phase of funding, have to sign assurances that they're going to make progress in these four areas. It's not a long form. The application's out. They simply have to sign the assurances. To receive the last third of funding by the end of September, the states will have to submit additional information, which we've begun to outline in the documents released this week, about how metrics will be put in place in each of these four areas. And those plans will need to be reviewed and approved by the department before those funds are released at the end of September. And the draft of those metrics were put out this week. They'll go into a Federal Register notice later in April. There'll be a period of public comment. And there'll be a final rule that will come out later, which will then become, the really hard criteria by which those second phase of stabilization fund applications will be judged. And the theory behind the metrics in these assurances is that we are trying to require, through the stabilization fund, unprecedented transparency in these four areas in exchange for this unprecedented funding. Race to the Top will actually give states the chance to make dramatic progress in the actual content of the areas. ESEA will give a chance to make much more progress. But the Stabilization Fund is really designed to ensure that there's total transparency in these four areas. So I'll give one or two examples before turning it over to Mike. In the area of higher standards and college readiness and career readiness, there's a requirement that states would track not only the percentage of kids graduating from high school by LEA in school, but also matriculation in college, and what percentage of students matriculate in college and complete a year's worth of college credit within 2 years after 2 years of graduation. And essentially, this is a way to say, okay, our kids really being prepared college ready. Can they get to college and can they actually complete a year's worth of college credit in college? One other example is in the teacher effectiveness area, there's a requirement that the states and school systems report the number and percentage of teachers and principals at different performance levels in the teacher and principal evaluation systems. And that's an area we could spend more time on the specifics, but one likely outcome of that will be that people will see data showing that 95+% of teachers and principals are all rated at the highest levels, which will help highlight the fact that there's not much disaggregation of assessment of how people are doing, which means you can't usefully give people feedback, trigger professional development, make decisions about rewarding teachers without a much higher quality system that really can differentiate between where people are doing.
So it's a couple-step process, and I have a lot of faith and trust in folks, and I really believe most people are going to work in absolute good faith and do the right thing by children. But when it doesn't happen, what do we do? A couple thoughts. Obviously, as Tony said, we put out a very significant amount of money this week, but we held back a very significant amount of money. And if we see states not acting in bad, not acting in good faith, acting in bad faith, playing shell games, not working in the best interest of children, we'll withhold literally billions of dollars. And we have the legal authority to do that. Secondly, we have this $5 billion race to the top fund, an unprecedented amount of discretionary money. And if states are messing around or doing whatever, they'll basically just eliminate themselves from the competition. And this is hundreds and hundreds of millions of additional dollars to get out to states. And so we have a real tough carrot, a real tough stick, and also a very, very significant carrot. And the first question, we are still developing the Race to the Top RFP, but the first question on that, I promise you, is going to be what did you do with the stabilization money to drive reform and improve student achievement and be innovative. And if there isn't a good answer to that, they might as well just tear up the form and not waste their time.
So the purpose of the education section of the Recovery Act, obviously, is to invest in education. If I think as you've seen this play out, if there's any state that intends to use any portion of the Education Stabilization Fund for anything but education, it won't be allowed. Second question then is, you said, okay, if that's true, what about how this relates to the level of state investment in education? And we're going to vigorously enforce the maintenance of effort requirement in the bill, and that if there's an interest in waiving that, then the principle that will be applied to considering waivers is whether the state is at least maintaining a proportional investment in education. So if there's been a big drop in revenues, that's okay, but are they maintaining at least a proportional investment there? This gets a little technical, but there are other tools. If the state needs to ask for the state stabilization fund to count toward maintenance of effort for Title I or IDA, again, that would only we'll look very carefully at whether the state will be maintaining or increasing its proportion of investment in education there. And finally, there will be transparency around this. So states will report out, and the public will be able to see how much states investing in education, what percentage the states investing in education, and where if there's questions, it'll be very clear for everyone to see, and we'll be calling people out on that.
Great, thank you.
Good morning. Robert Strange with the National Conference of State Legislatures. I couldn't have asked for a better lead-in to my question than Mary right there. My question really has to do with some of the messages we've been receiving from the department over the last few months, and particularly with the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund and the lack of any mention of the involvement of state legislators in implementing this and their role in all this. And especially when it comes to stabilization fund, as that relates to states figuring out their budgets. Legislators are in session right now trying to figure out how they're going to incorporate the stabilization fund in their budgets, meet the maintenance of effort requirements. And earlier this week on a conference call that many of you were on, the question was asked, what role do state legislators play in the state fiscal stabilization fund? And the answer from the department was none. So I would just ask you, what efforts are you going to take to try to involve legislators more in this? Is there really an important piece to making this a successful recovery?
Well, the legislatures play a crucial role, obviously, in driving education for the entire state, and the budgets that legislatures are passing are ultimately going to be the budgets affecting education in the states and the policies. So I think we're trying to work with all groups to get out information, to get perspectives. If you've got specific ideas how we could be doing that better with state legislatures around the country, we'd love to. We think the communications flow is absolutely crucial. And if you've got other specific ideas about ways that we could be working with legislatures, it's a huge issue, and we'd love to sit down with you and get your ideas for how to do so.